Hi friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. Now, when we all found out that Donnie Yen was going to be in Rogue One, we were all like, holy crap, an Asian Jedi? Or if you didn't know who he was, who the hell's that Asian guy? Followed by, holy crap, an Asian Jedi? But then we were thrown a curveball by director Gareth Edwards when he announced to the world that this movie would feature no Force users. Then it became even more confusing when we started seeing photos of Donnie Yen as blind dude. And when the movie finally came out, we got this. Which was epic and funny and amazing, but what the hell was going on? Is this guy a Jedi? Is he a daredevil? Or is he some crazy Chinese monk with very gifted physical abilities? Well, after doing some research, he's actually a bit of everything. You see, Chirrut has what's called an echo box. It's a machine that constantly clicks and also has some kind of motion detection ability and warns its users about obstructions with little vibrations. He wears it around his neck at all times. It's that metal box with a really big red button. So it's easier for him to see. Which means Chirrut is able to do what he does in these crazy fight scenes because he's using a form of echolocation. What is echolocation? Well, it's essentially biological sonar. Remember all those sub-movies that were really popular in the 80s and 90s with the non-Russian actors pretending to be Russian?
Not advisable, Captain. I did not ask for your advice.
Or in some cases, they would just be like, whatever, Sean Connery.
New Ruski.
Nimnoga.
What gives you the right to fire on my ship?
Well, one of the key technologies on display was sonar. Essentially, ships would send out a sound wave and wait for it to bounce back when it hits an object. Because we know how sound travels, a computer will take that data and make calculations and determine where that object is and how large it is. Whales, dolphins, bats, and Daredevil all have a biological version of this sonar, thanks to evolution and radioactive goo. Now, of course, these animals and superheroes have extraordinary abilities that humans just don't. A whale, for instance, can hear another whale from over 1,000 miles away. Bats can navigate with echolocation at high speeds in completely pitch black environments. And Daredevil can afford a giant loft in Hell's Kitchen working as a pro bono lawyer. But do humans have this ability? Can we be like Daredevil? Let's try an experiment. Close your eyes, now make a sound with your mouth like ah, and hold that tone. While holding that tone, take your hand, palm facing your face, and move it across your mouth. Never touching your mouth, but keeping within like 1 or 2 inches. Now, if you're doing this in a public space, people probably think you're crazy. Awesome. But in all seriousness, most of you probably won't notice much of a difference in the sound. But if you're a sound engineer or you're a musician or someone who's very sensitive to noise, you'll notice a slight difference in the tone. It becomes a little bit muffled. So for those of us who are able to notice the difference, we should be able to maneuver in a room in the dark and sense walls and other obstructions if they're within a few inches of our face, as long as we're going, which is pretty much useless. The thing is, our brains actively suppress echoes in an effort to filter out unnecessary noise so we can actually understand other people. That's why the majority of people won't notice the difference between a sound wave bouncing from 2 feet away compared to a sound wave bouncing from 10 feet away. But since the 18th century, there have been reported cases of blind people using echolocation in order to orient themselves and understand the space around them. At the same time, there have been no reports of people with sight using this ability. The brain is like the CPU of a computer. You have a limited amount of processing power that you can devote to different programs. In our bodies, these programs are our hearing, smell, sight, or even our thoughts. The more applications you close, the more processing power we have available to use on different programs. So let's say your hearing ability is the program Battlefield 4. Now, the average person who has all their senses can run Battlefield 4 at 1080p with 30 frames per second at a high graphics setting. But then let's say we close our program that runs our vision, our smell, and basically everything but our hearing ability. All of a sudden, we're sniping people across the map while jumping out of airplanes because we're running Battlefield 4 at 4K, 120 FPS at ultra graphic settings. Another study showed that when blind people use echolocation, their calciferin cortex, or the part of their brain that usually helps an individual see, becomes active. The theory is these individuals are able to collect data through their ears and then use the calciferin cortex in their brain to translate that information into visual information. Of course, this rewiring of the brain doesn't happen to all blind people, and researchers are trying to figure out if this is something that some individuals are predisposed to or if it's something that can be trained. Now, in the case study that I mentioned, the two subjects are actually able to use echolocation and determine the shape of objects in the room. It just shows us how adaptable and amazing the human body can be with a little bit of training and good genetics. But in the end of the day, humans aren't evolved like bats and whales to use echolocation. So as far as being able to do stuff like this, I don't really think it's possible for humans to achieve this yet, especially without some help. Maybe all we need to do is increase the amount of data our brains collect from the environment. Ears have pretty limited coverage, and they're not really that sensitive when compared to a lot of animals. Maybe in the future we can develop hearing aids or echolocation devices like the one Chirrut is wearing and translate that data into a blind person's calcium cortex. But Chirrut doesn't just fight well for our blind person, he fights better than most people who can see. So how does that happen? Well, Chirrut uses the Force, but not in the traditional way. According to canon books, Chirrut can feel the Force all around him, and at times he becomes one with the Force. It doesn't mean he's using the Force, but he can sense it. And when he does that, he can actually see everything around him, kind of like Neo in the Matrix. Well, that is if the Force exists. Maybe what's actually happening to him is that in the middle of combat, the adrenaline in his body helps him become hyper-focused, and he can translate sound waves more quickly into visual data using his calcium cortex, just like the people in the study. I love Rogue One because it tries so hard to be realistic. It shows us an unseen side of Star Wars. Far away from the main plot where stormtroopers can't hit anything and the heroes always make it out alive, and the only thing they really lose are a few limbs. It shows us a world where the Jedi and the Force are essentially a myth, which if you really think about it, was probably the prevailing mindset at the time. And building on that, what if all the Star Wars movies were actually legends and myths? Propaganda stories made by the victors of the Galactic Civil War. What if Rogue One was the first true Star Wars story that didn't try to gloss over things with fantasy and magical things like the Force? What if it was a character like Chirrut, a blind man with seemingly supernatural abilities that inspired such tales? From a certain perspective, it's definitely easy to confuse Chirrut for a Jedi.
Is he a Jedi?
There are no Jedi here anymore. Only dreamers like this fool.
The Force did protect me.
All it takes is a broken line of communication. We've all played a game of telephone where the original story turns into a tall tale. What if Luke, like Donnie Yen, was just a normal boy who got lucky, like Han Solo? I know it's sacrilege and probably not true, but I think it's an interesting thing to think about. Which is why I cherish this film much more than something like Force Awakens, because it tries something new and in turn adds to the legend that is Star Wars. Well guys, that's all we have for you today. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button so you don't miss out on all of our latest and greatest content. And a special thanks to all you Patreon supporters out there. If I was Daredevil, I would invite you guys all to check out my amazing loft. Thanks for joining us. If you're watching this, you are Generation Tech.